Welcome to The Way of Nature, and it's wonderful having an old friend and long-term student as well, Doug Canterbury-Counts, here today with us. I've known Doug for quite a while, and vice versa. So it's a great pleasure to have you back, Doug.
My honor.
We've been missing our times in Florida, which got a little interrupted by COVID. So this Zoom thing will have to step in the meantime. But maybe you can share a little bit about yourself. And what I can say is that Doug has a very powerful background in Jungian therapy. He's also a member of a wonderful spiritual community in Florida called Kashi, which is founded many years ago by a German Mahajaya, and who I had a very close friendship with. And it's wonderful to have Doug here today. He is going to be sharing a few stories about some of what he's gone through over the past decades with The Way of Nature.
You know, it was funny when you're talking with Brian, 30 years. You know, Brian came in July and I came in August of 92. So 30 years it's this year, John.
It's amazing.
Amazing.
Time flies.
Yeah. So I would just jump in by saying briefly, you know, I'd been through some life story in my 20s and 30s. You know, academically, you know, pursued education, some scholarship to a Baptist seminary. Out of that came a PhD in psychology. But all the while, I was shaped by my incidences as a Marine in Vietnam, and then coming out of that, some real trouble in my life. And, you know, we don't make a secret of it, we can come back to it, but just the hell realms. And so in the hell realms, you know, I was introduced to a level of spiritual experience that shaped my life. Carl Jung has an interesting phrase, I'll paraphrase, that if you're fortunate, life slaps you upside the head. He says if fate is benevolent. I say, if you're fortunate, life slaps you upside the head while you're young enough to start asking the right questions. That doesn't close down the possibility that my oldest patient was 85 when he started this work. By the time he was 95 and passed on, he'd moved from deep depression to joyful living. You're never too late. And yet, for those people who start asking what matters most, you know, this process is such a gift that I'm hoping to communicate today. I want to talk a little bit, get you talking about the 12 principles, which in my experience, it started with that first passage in 92. The Center for Sacred Psychology came out of that vision quest, that sacred passage, Way of Nature program. There was this sense of seeing my work as a psychologist and a therapist coming together with what Sacred Passage offered me. Since then, and I did count them up because, you know, Brian had that 50 number, you know, and Per, I think, has 25 plus or so. So I thought I better count them up. Well, I got traditionals with Sacred Passages. I've got 19 of them under my belt. But what I did that these other suckers didn't do is I brought you to me, because I couldn't come up with the money, raising a family and all that to come every year. I could have, but I didn't. But I counted it up, John. You've been to Kashi 11 times. So you've been to Pine Jog Air in West Palm. We did that 2 or 3 times. So what I did, I was a smart cookie. I brought you to me. And so I at least got to keep the teaching alive from year to year. Yeah, so I appreciate that you came. So in 92, my wife went first. I went first to Lost Hollow Farm. And she came back so fierce, so clear. I was stunned. We'd been married at that point 15 years. Well, I didn't want to take her thunder because I tend to be this gregarious guy and stuff. And I knew this was so powerful in her life. So I didn't push it, but I wondered what would that be like, what she went through. Well, 3 months later, she said, if you don't go, we're not going to make it. She was fierce, right? She came back knowing our marriage needed to shaken up, right? So I went in August of 92. So that experience was when I was initiated by a mountain lion, my first morning out.
Where did you go? Which area?
In Crestone. But that mountain lion experience changed my life. You know, I was carrying my water out early in the morning. My head was down, following the trail. I kept losing the trail. I was staying on the ridge adjacent toward the north of the white quartz crystal rocks. So I was staying there, and I thought, you said we had 108 paces. So I thought as the eagle flies from ridge to ridge, I could go to the top of the white rock. So I would come down and I would go up there and do my practice on the top. And then I would come down to the bottom and do my practice down on the bottom with my Tai Chi practice. And someone had made a medicine wheel, and this is significant for my story, at the bottom out of the white rocks. So my whole first passage was immersed in this white quartz crystal. There was as I was walking, carrying my water, a presence that I felt. And I looked up, and a mountain lion was roughly 30 paces above me. You know, those steep cliffs. I knew there was no running, no getting away. And so I just slowly put my water down, and I looked up at this lion, and I cried out. I said, "Lion, I need to use your mountain for a week to cleanse my soul." And the lion simply dropped down. She'd been standing on all fours. She simply dropped down. And I took that as permission. Went on, left my water at the site, went back. She was gone. In midweek of that week, some men came to take truckloads of those white quartz crystal. You probably wouldn't remember this, but they couldn't get up that dirt path because it's like the great sand dunes, all that sand, right? They couldn't get up. Well, they went back down in the valley and came cross country. And I'm sitting on top of the white quartz, 100 feet above them. And they're down there talking about taking truckloads of this out. I walked down that mountain, and I was the lion. And, you know, I've got this nice guy persona, but that day I was fierce. I walked down that mountain like a lion, and I'm standing on, and by this time I'm scruffy, and, you know, I got these little shorts on and some moccasins, and that's all. And I told these men that they just couldn't, they had to get out and go away. But I was so fierce in my telling of it. They accused me of being a hippie or a vegetarian. That was but they left. Right? What are you, vegetarian? But it was just a moment in time. And I walked back up, and I was just filled with rage at this world that we live in. And it was my rage. And I've been working on my rage for 50 years now. But it was my rage. And I'm filled with rage, and I just said, to hell with all of humanity. And I turned my back on the San Luis Valley, and I walked straight up that mountain to get away from people and straight roads and everything. I got up to the top of that mountain, and I looked over, and I'm looking down into the campsite, and there's people. I couldn't get away from them. What I learned on that is to, first of all, follow the trail that the animals make instead of going straight up the damn mountain. Learn how to pay attention. I came down. The end of this, too long of a story, but it's important to me. It's the foundation. I came down, and I had wanted to see the lion, through the week. I, was attached. But when I came down on that road was hundreds of lion paws over their tire tracks, literally hundreds. It was as if that lion danced on top of their tire tracks. All of that connected you and I, because you also have totem encounter with lion. And so I just was home. I tried to leave, and I broke into tears there at the end of the road, the dirt road of our precious land sanctuary. And you just said, just go. And if you can, you said, do 1 day a week, 1 weekend a month, and 1 week a year in solitude in the wilderness. So that was my foundation. And that's what I left with. It was 3 years before I came back. Just young man, young, new practice, young, new baby, reasons that I just, but I knew this was my path. In 95, we went with Ma to Peace Prayer Day there in Espanola. And we told our 5-year-old son, we're taking him to Crestone. I went up that path to the upper lake with my son. We got to the creek that was just, in the spring, was just flowing. I couldn't take him across that spindly bridge. But I heard the mountain call me. I heard the mountain say, you must go higher and deeper. So in August, I came back. And so that time I went up higher and deeper. I went up to the top of the mountain. I could tell these stories, but again, 95, just the idea of life-changing experiences. I came down, I didn't see how I could go in 96, so I did 4 days on Kashi. We had moved there in 96. And John, when I put my tent down, I had 4 days of solitude that I could give myself. The land began to sing kirtan to me, sacred song, sacred music in the Hindu tradition. Still couldn't make it, but by 99, I was starting to get that this was my path. And so then I went to Baja. And from then, progressively, every year, I was able to either go on a passage. In 05, I did the 28 days, 3 passages that year. Well, the last one we were up at Amrit Desai's wasn't really a passage there, a training. But I did 2, Baja and Crestone, 28 days. And then, there was a period of stretch there, a few years, but I was bringing you in every year to teach. So progressively, I've done 19 of them. I just found that this was my way. Now, let me bring it back. Let me bring it back to the 12 principles. You gave a teaching of psychological, spiritual growth with the 12 principles. And I believe that this is what our world needs. And as an eco-psychology model, which people talk about it, you've been doing this all your life. The ability to heal the split between inner nature and outer nature, and in your language, to discover true nature, right? This is what people are going to therapy for and spending thousands and thousands of dollars. This ritual that you've created and offer us, I want to talk about it. I want to talk about how these 12 principles succinctly bring together what are the right questions we need to be asking these days. You've got a model that I think the world needs to hear. You got any thoughts? I'm rambling now. You got any thoughts?
Well, with just one little add on the 12 principles, the full name I gave them way back when is the 12 principles of natural liberation. Liberation meaning becoming free from all the things that cause pain and sorrow and unhappiness. And natural liberation, emphasizing the fact that we have this capacity within ourselves naturally, if we just give it a chance, to bring about an inner freedom from the pain and the suffering and the experience of the joy of this lifetime and rejoining the big family of all life. So that's just a little elaboration on.
It's a roadmap to the soul. I don't know if I can take the time here from you, to be able to just succinctly. When I started, there were 7. I pulled those 7 up just to see him, but they evolved, and rightly so. To the 12. The 13th is very important, and we'll come to that at the end. But the 12 principles. The first one, that where all form is interdependent and continuously changing, constantly arising from and dissolving back into source. Would you talk a little bit about that? If we don't say anything more today, that first principle, how important it is for our world to understand that now.
Sure. One of the things that is the source of a lot of the pain that we experience in this lifetime is becoming very attached to, addicted to both our sense of who we are, or it's a continual habitual self-referencing habit, and then also becoming very attached to all the form aspects that we experience in this lifetime, meaning friends, family, loved ones, enemies, workplace, country, nation, state, and all that kind of thing. And we look on many of these things as fairly fixed. I'm in a good marriage, this is gonna, and we have that sense this is gonna.
Don't get me started on marriage. 45 years, I'm starting to get it right.
Yeah, and of course, you've discovered that a marriage may appear to be the same thing and stable, but actually it's a very dynamic, continuously changing, evolving relationship.
It's true.
And you're both in relationship to each other, evolving through over time as we look back on it.
That's it.
So the first principle, I should give a little background that it came out of my study of many different traditions, Hindu, right, Tibetan, Taoist, Native American, other shamanic traditions from around the world, and a few other pathways. And I was very interested in those that included nature as part of the picture. Also, especially if nature was part of the temple and also had a teacher aspect contained within it, as Native Americans often really exemplify. So the 12 principles evolved out of finding the common ground. Where do all these great traditions come together? What do they have in common? Do we need to fight each other about who has the best tradition? Because it seemed to me one of the offerings of the kind of training that we now offer in the way of nature would be to find out what is the nature of the fundamental truth that these great traditions share in common. What are the core principles and practices of those traditions? And then we could, from our own standpoint, out of our own background and culture, we could come to other traditions and see, oh, we have this in common. And you could begin to relate to your brothers and sisters of other traditions and pathways from a standpoint of, oh, we really have a lot in common. We don't have to fight about things. Who's got the best thing? So that was one motivation. The other motivation was to find the common ground of deep nature connectivity that would help to resolve the massive environmental crisis, which our planet is now being consumed by. So that first principle is embedded both in both the nature of how the forms of nature appear to manifest themselves, and also how our experience of culture and spirituality and religion also manifest. So the principle states that all forms are arising from source. If you look into most of the great traditions, the name for God or goddess or the Godhead or the great mystery is, and one of the terms we use a lot because it's kind of culture free, is source. And by source, we mean that fundamental base consciousness or base awareness, base beingness that underlies all experiences of life. And out of that pure consciousness, all these forms manifest and display. And as they manifest, they are in a relationship, a completely interwoven, vast ecology of form, interrelated form. The Buddhists call that how all forms codependently arise in connection with each other. They didn't look on codependence as a problem, just as a reality.
Of course.
And, I was been bemused by that. So the first principle really honors the fact that all these form aspects that we experience through our senses and through our lifetime are in a state of continuous change and transformation. There's not one thing that manifests in the world of form that is fixed and constant and not subject to the law of transformation and change. And once we really understand that, then we are less dependent upon becoming attached to a fixed form. We try to fixate form into some sort of stable entity, which we can then count on for being able to control our lives. And this includes our sense of individuated self, by the way. So the arising of the ego consciousness is another aspect of that fixed form aspect that become very attached to it, addicted to it once it's been developed. Then we kind of hold on to that for your life, because that's we see that as our fundamental reference point. So it applies to both outer nature, this form aspect, and the inner nature aspect of ourselves. By inner nature, it's not just the personality and the ego, but it's also this amazing dance of what we call in the way of nature, the 9 experiential fields of sight, sound, touch, which are kind of 3 primary ones. And then, of course, smell and taste, which also are important. And then the experience of movement and balance that goes along with movement, and the experience of the life force and energy. And then, of course, those 7 form a kind of a experiential basis for how we experience life. And then we have various relationships to those experiences. And that brings in the 8th and 9th experiential field of emotions and how they display, and thoughts. So those are the 9 fields of experience which display this continuously changing form aspect. So it's so one of the first things we do is to try to get that sense of how really there's nothing in the world of experience that has a stable, unchanging aspect in the world of form.
Nothing.
There's nothing that's stable, including ourselves. We think of ourselves as something stable, but obviously from birth, when we were tiny little, in the womb, we're a tiny little egg formed from the mother's egg and sperm and the father's sperm to the growth into a gigantic hominid clumping around in the sidewalks of New York City. During that transition, there's a continuous process of change from the small egg through birth, through childhood, baby stage, teenage years, and then into the various stages of our experience of life. Maybe we enter into family relationship. Maybe as you did, we go to war, if our culture asks us to do that. And we have the experience during all of this of having sickness and health affect us on a fairly regular basis. So even our experience of health and well-being is subject to change all the time. All of us have had different illnesses, sicknesses, and then finally, at the end of all of this, we die.
Mhm.
And this physical form completely dissolves and returns its physical elements back to the earth and the gases of the atmosphere. So we don't normally think about ourselves like this, but it's healthy to do that because it minimizes your fixation on having some kind of stable, enduring, unchanging form aspect in life that you can count on to control. In point of fact, there is no such thing. And so if you begin to have the experience of that reality of continuous change, and you also begin to explore where do these form aspects come from, you go back into the base of where form arises, all the different aspects I talked about with the 9 experiential fields of form. You discover they all arise from that pure consciousness. And so if you follow, instead of going constantly out into the world and becoming completely embedded in a sense attached and reactive to that outer world, if you take a moment to turn that around and move back in,
Mhm.
where they're experienced at the deepest level internally, you discover they all go back to pure consciousness, pure awareness. And that begins to uncover a kind of state of pristine awareness or pure source, which is our true foundation. It's primary, it's prior to the ego, it's prior to all this, the 9 experiential fields that display the forms, or through which we experience the forms. So that allows the forms to begin to uncover the truth of this base source level of being, that the more you become connected to that, more it begins to replace, or can replace, the referencing process. Instead of being referencing to your outward experiences and your outward expressions, and also to your stories about who you are,
Mhm.
support the sense of self and individuated ego.
Right.
Instead, you start to reference this vast and spacious, boundless consciousness, which is the true foundation of our being. And through that comes great experience of liberation. At the same time, as you're taking that journey in the way of nature, we explore each one of those 9 fields as a means to refine our ability to connect with the outer world of nature, the outer display. And so that process gives us a chance to go through stages of connection, communion, even unity experiences with trees and flowers and other
Mhm.
humans, and even ecosystems. And ultimately, you follow all those experiences back into source. But in the meantime, you've established a very powerful foundation of connection to the big family of life. And that begins to help heal the disconnection that so many of us are experiencing these days as we live in the large cities and have very little actual contact with natural or wild nature. So the pathway helps to heal both finding a liberated essence within, where we come into contact with source aspect. And so the true nature begins to become more of what we reference ourselves to. And then secondly, on that journey, we begin to establish a much deeper connection to the family of all living things through the connection process. So it helps to bring in a healing energy towards things like climate change and environmental destruction and catastrophe. And we learn how to want to rejoin the big family of life. So we begin to start helping shift culture in those directions, because we do have that capability and potential creativity. So anyway, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
It's a great answer, and there's so many ways to jump in. I was proud of myself to not interrupt you as I tend to do, and we'll web weave, we'll keep bringing these threads back and forth. But what I want to reinforce here is the lived experience that Sacred Passage provides, that these experiences, the way of nature provides. The lived experience, it's not a cognitive, although there's teachings and although we draw, and you've pointed in the directions of any numbers of teachings, friends now on the shelves behind me, because that's my approach. I was the 10-year-old in the library. My mom was the librarian at Lancaster Library in Pennsylvania there. And so she'd take the kid in, and I'm the guy punching them. Remember the old cards they used to stick in the back of your library? So I've been a reader since I was, a child, coming from that. So the ability to, seek out this wisdom, but there was something missing. And Sacred Passage opened up a lived experience of source. I tasted it. The hell realms after Vietnam was a Japanese prison for nearly 2 years, 20 months in there, of solitude, mostly solitude, silence. There was no noise allowed. I've worked in American prisons, and they could learn something from the Japanese approach. The noise that demands it's too easy to distract. The silence, and 5 times a day of, getting on your knees and asking forgiveness from your family for having put them through this pain. That approach was transformative as well. In that process, I experienced source, and I didn't know this language then. No religious background, some as a child, traditional Bible school stuff, but the old man was burnt. He was an educator, an administrator of 2 counties in Pennsylvania at the end of his career, but burned by his mother, my grandmother's, she was a snake handler, she was that kind of religious person, and Southwestern Virginia. So there was no religion in my house. There were 13. She was a snake handler.
Really? Did she pick up
Koozie? Boy, she was a tough woman. Her children suffered under this woman. Yeah, we don't get started on those stories. Yeah, right.
For another session.
The point of it is that they were starving, and she was giving the food to the evangelist coming through, and who was sleeping with the local. It was just a mess there, and so he was against all religion, and so we didn't get any of it. I was introduced to Buddhism as a young Marine in Memphis, Tennessee, by a gunnery sergeant and his Japanese wife. And so I was drawn to that teaching. And so in the years before I went to Vietnam, I was associated with hippies out in LA that were great and dear friends and introducing me to Eastern thought. Of course, the drugs, the psychedelics, big part of our time now. Now they're looking at how psychedelics are transformative in a positive way. The research has come back around to what cultures have known, this kind of thing, but altered states of consciousness. So I move forward from there. I'm going to bring myself back here. I move forward from there, knowing something that I was missing when I got out. Went into traditional Christian religion at that point. Sitting on a hay bale in a church in a barn in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when I got back for a month in a full lotus, dancing Tai Chi. These people thought I was nuts, but they just wore me down with their, peace. And finally, I had that born again experience, and it was profound and it was wonderful. The charismatic renewal was trying to bring something alive. It's that damn theology, that condemning, judgmental theology. So I went off to seminary from there, and ended up with just grace, being invited to a full Masters of Divinity in Eastern Baptist Seminary in Philadelphia, got a scholarship there. And the first semester, I took a course on psychology, never had psychology. I got 8 weeks of Carl Jung, 8 weeks of Sigmund Freud, and 1 week of all the other psychologists in the 20th century. This old professor.
Any Reich?
No, probably not in that story. You know, we've talked about our friend Reich, you know, and he has a place to play. But at that point, it was this introduction to a psychology that Carl Jung presented that did not focus so much on where I came from, i.e. my childhood trauma, as to where I'm going, true nature. You know, this path of individuation, you use that term, you know, this idea of a journey. And of course, he drew a lot of that from his encounters progressively in the East. So that became an academic, intellectual understanding of a path to soul that started to help me weave together my experiences. It was that experience of source. So is it the Christian language? Was it the Buddhist language? You know, I kept turning and looking. You know, somewhere in there, probably around 95, you said that you need to dig at least 2 wells. How did this go? You said you need to dig your well in religion 80 feet deep. And I said, well, John, do you just dig 1 well 80 foot deep or 4 wells 20 feet deep? And you looked at me and you said, you need to dig at least 2 wells 150 feet deep. Well, I've done that, you know, I immersed myself in that. Came out of that, was given a full ride to, or given an invitation to a doctoral program in psychology. All of this was just flow. Looking back, I connect these nodal points, you know, the idea of there was a path. Joe Campbell's language, if you follow your bliss, you will find a path laid out in front of you that is waiting for you all along, and you begin to live the life you were meant to be living. I can't tell you, everybody's searching for that. I have sent dozens of people, and have known dozens more, to Sacred Passage, Way of Nature, over these 30 years. Not one ever came back saying that that was a waste of money or time. Everybody came back with clarity. No problem gets fixed. There's direction, there's vision. But really what it is a lived experience of connecting with that deeper self. What Jung's language was, it's different. The ego is not this all central complex. It's just the tip of the iceberg, as the philosophers would say. The great depth that's out of view. That's where the real mysteries lies, and that's where the real aliveness lies. So I went on Sacred Passage. I sent people in Sacred Passage. I tell people then and now, save you a year of therapy, of analytical therapy anyway. Does a person know that there is a life waiting for them that is an authentic life, a genuine life? Most people are just trying to put out the fires, John. So, you know, I want to bring it back to just, again, the principle of connecting with source has been a progression for me. The passages are invariant. When I go out and spend this time in solitude, and I'm old school, I still advocate for no books and no journals, although I allow for, you know, the evolution of the teaching and your experience now, that to just make sure that I don't let them become traps to distract me from source. And you taught how to do that. You've taught us how to do that. But just to be stripped away. Now, the first 3 days of decontraction, right? The mind just going crazy. You had said initially tradition is 4 days, but you found that we European Westernist people we're just too wired. Clearly, I'm one of them, right? This is the new and improved version. You know, all of this mind, all of this stuff that's spinning and spinning. So the idea of an invitation into getting silent, the invitation to having no distraction. That first Sacred Passage, reading Dr. Bronner's Soap endlessly, reading the tuna can, all the fine, something my mind grasping onto because it's so frightening to have nothing to think about. And then I become squirrel. I became lion, you know, I become tree. I just am. That's a lived experience. I feel chills telling you about this now because it's this connection to my source, right? I learned how to be. Guess what? I come home, first day, I'll tell you a story. I came out of Moab. You know, Michelle put me into the Sal Mountains, her 40 acres up there last year after I left you. And had an amazing teaching with the trees and Father Son. Father Son has been with me ever since. Now it's Pops in my lingo. Father Son initiated me last year. I came out of that sacred 7 days of solitude and quiet and just enjoyed my drive with my dog through Utah, got down to the north rim of the Grand Canyon a few days later. And don't you know, my equanimity got snapped away by a lady yelling at me about my dog, even though I was in the right. And I found, boom, right there, I just react back to, wanting to get back at her, wanting to get into it, wanting to say that. So the idea that I became a better version of myself or complete or whole? No, but in that moment, I had to laugh. I had to get a sense of humor about any ego inflation I had that I know something is humbled by the idea of I'm just dipping my toe into source. And I really have work to do. So sacred passage works for me. That brings me to the second principle. Commit yourself completely to liberation in this lifetime. I want to read you a quote. Our Taoist friend, Zhuang Tzu, right? Great truths do not interest the multitudes. And now that the world is in such confusion, even though I know the path, how can I guide? I know I cannot succeed and that trying to force results, I shall merely add to the confusion. Isn't it better to give up and stop striving? But then, if I do not strive, who will? I think that's our problem, that people are intrigued by sacred passage by way of nature. I think that there is a sense of knowing that this is a profound opportunity, but the ego's defenses are significant. And it's easy to not pursue that second principle, and you're not a judge. Nobody judges this, but the idea of the great truths that need to interest the multitudes. People avoid doing this kind of work. In therapy, it's the same. Again, Carl Jung, that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, shadow work, right? He goes on to say, but that's uncomfortable for most, the multitudes don't want to hear. So I want to introduce that thought for you now. How do you invite people who increasingly in our culture are realizing there's so much more that they've been missing following, the institutional or organized way of who you should be? And then, in the 60s and the 70s, people trying to break free on some of these old restraints, getting crazy and, still being mean and nasty, right? Ended up, New Age movement coming in, people again turning to other traditions, other cultures. Are we evolving as a culture? I don't know. I'll let you speak to that. But the idea of a vehicle here for people to commit 12 days to commit to a process that I can assure you from literally dozens and dozens of stories. I'll read you one before we're done today. People are changed by this experience. So how do you help people commit to liberation in this lifetime? Or is that a silly question? Can you speak to that?
Very relevant question. And it, some years ago, we when I was pulling together the 12 principles, and the one you were talking about was the second principle, which naturally follows from the first principle. That first principle gets into everything is in the world of form changes, and also all form aspects are interconnected in a vast ecology of form, and they all arise from source. All of it arises from source, goes back into it, and manifests in the field of that.
Mm.
So the second principle basically says, okay, if you really kind of get the potential of understanding that at a deep and profound level, the way you've just been describing, one of the most helpful things you can do is to mobilize your individuality in this temporary ego that we inhabit. Take that personality and make a commitment to full liberation and unfoldment of the inner truth.
Mm.
Ideally in this lifetime. Don't try to put it off too much. And that commitment of the individuated personality to full liberation from all the experiences of pain and suffering that one goes through, provides an imperative, internal imperative that then begins to take on a life of its own. And it opens up a pathway that actually awakens the possibility for full liberation. And if you're fortunate in this lifetime, it might be, according to many classical traditions, it's many lifetimes, but we say we don't know.
We don't know.
And basically, it may be many, it may be right the next few moments. And I came up, you like this, Doug. I realized that presence is really taking the moments and going deep enough with each moment and really embracing full presence so that the moment becomes the oment.
Yeah, right. I want to jump in there. I did this 40-day pilgrimage last year where my dog and I took 2 months, and my dog and I hit the road, and I was driving, I think it was in Oklahoma. And I'd been days on the road at this point, but I was coming in west, and it dawned on me that when I'm present in my driving, I felt awe at the beauty of nature. And how much of my driving was spent driving, as we do, asleep at the wheel, right? Missing the exit that we've taken 100 times. How much of driving's thinking about that and that. And I began to experience presence in a different way that became more solidified, if you will, more apparent to me about the importance. Now, I asked you one time, how would you define moksha, liberation? And you paused in your manner. And then you said, to be completely present and completely relaxed.
Yeah.
I want a pregnant pause there. It sounds so simple. To be completely present and completely relaxed. That's my whole job, to help people. You taught me that. I've been living into that. I want to encourage people. This is not a place that you get to. This is a process, but there are tools, just as, having an efficient vehicle will, enhance getting to where it is you want to go. Of course, the paradox is where I want to get to is right here. I want to be here. I want to be present, but to be relaxed, I didn't know. I'd been meditating for 20 years at that point. And I went on that first sacred passage in Crestone. After the 3 days of this mind going crazy I told you about, I never forget, it's a joke, but reading Dr. Bronner, I never read all of that. I was glad I had the big version because, there's a lot of words on that Dr. Bronner soap, anybody who knows.
Those who don't know what he's talking about, Dr. Bronner came in a little kind of plastic bottle.
Yeah, right.
Soap that had the blue covers.
Still does. I got it in my shower.
And there's a lot of text, all condensed into a very small amount of space, about Dr. Bonner's philosophy of life.
Really, which is living in the one, being part of connected to source, But something to occupy my mind. After that 3 days, though, then the 4 days of really entering into this relaxed state, even with the encounter with these guys stealing the rocks and there was this opening up. Jai had told me to spend all night under the full moon. I did that on top of the white quartz crystal, and was given this first 3 syllables, three words of what is now an 11-word mantra that is with me all the time. And those first 3 words were Om, Ma, Hum. And it was your license plate, except it was Om Ahum, and we have laughed endlessly since then, how 3 months before I met Ma, Jaya Sati Bhagavati, 3 months before I had even thought about Guru, I had no interest in Guru Yoga. Little did I know how much I had to learn about devotion and the true gift of Guru Yoga. Right? I didn't even think about it at that point, but you, 3 months before I got into that, explained to me what Vasudev meant to you and what Guru Yoga taught you and offered you. So my rigid intellectual judgmental piece about what Guru Yoga would look like was fractured. So when I met this wild and crazy teacher named Ma, right, in December, I was bringing Reb Zalman up to her, Rabbi Zalman Shachter Shalomai, some people would know Reb Zalman. I was bringing him up there to her. The story continued. Just following this path, following this joy, I got relaxed. My life since then has been a practice of learning how to relax. And I've got a long way to go, but I'm learning.
It's interesting, Doug, that one of the things that came through very clear in my own early work was that once you got that first principle of the interconnectivity and the continuous change aspect of the world of form, and then you committed yourself to really getting that at a foundational level of your being, then the next step was to begin to let go of all the obscurations and blockages and contractions that stood in the way of being fully in the now, fully present.
Yeah.
A lot of the teachings on presence and nowness, for some reason, because the West is so kind of hyped up, they really do not want to address the issue of lack of relaxation and all the contractions and the tensions that kind of bind us like this.
Yep.
Shackles. And so I realized early on that we needed to address those energetic, mental, emotional, physical, karmic, cultural, ancestral patterns of blockage and obscuration.
Yes,
In order to release them, let them open, let them unfold, and just release, so that we're no longer bound in the same patterns of deep holding and contraction, which maintain the life of the obscuration. I sometimes call it the way the inner demons maintain their lifetime within. So, so the pathway that seems to be pretty universal in most of the great enlightening traditions, after you've made that commitment to becoming really understanding and realizing and embodying the truth, the Dharma, deep spiritual truth, then two of the most main aspects are mastering the process of relaxation, decontraction, and unifying that with profound levels of deep and complete presence and nowness. And so many of my students began to learn a number of techniques for taking relaxation and bringing it in a very vital way into their lives, so it became a real thing. And we started with a deep relaxation practice, which involves just initially lying down and very slowly relaxing every part of the body from the crown to the soles of the feet, very slowly, and doing a simple visualization of releasing tensions at every level of your body, starting with the surface, moving into the internal aspects of the body, even the organ systems, and finally ending up even with the chakras and the meridians and the energy body that supports the rest of the entire physical system.
Mm.
And through that practice, people began to discover how many levels at which they were holding blockage and contraction. Then I brought in a number of other techniques and approaches to achieve relaxation at the energetic and the emotional and mental levels, which we don't have time to go into today. But a lot of the work we've done over the past 4 years was to do a very strong focus on developing approaches, 7 techniques of transformation of these blockages that prevent relaxation and presence, and working with them first at the physical body level, then working with them at the level of the energy body, the chakras, meridians that people use for acupuncture, which acupuncturists use to clear with acupuncture. Then at the level of the emotional body and the mental body, which of course, as you know better than most, feeds and continues the process of blockage manifestation. And then going even into the ancestral patterns that carry through from the family and the culture that you're embedded within, And then finally beginning to address, as we're learning today, especially, I think we're in the middle of an election here in the States, and there's all this bombardment of cultural influences going on. So the cultural conditioning aspect is very important. So the next one we begin to address is how do these cultural conditioning factors work on the contractions and the blockages and the obscurations? How do they support bringing out increased anger and contraction and blockage? And then finally working with it at the level of the karmic traces that move through from one lifetime to another as we reincarnate. So physical body, energy body, emotional body, mental body, ancestral pattern aspect, cultural conditioning aspect, and karmic traces that move through many lifetimes, and using the 7 techniques to transform, to honor and acknowledge the truth of, and then transform at each of those different bodies. So that's the work of the past 4 years during COVID that we've been engaged in. I'm just now beginning to bring that into the Way of Nature programs. In a nutshell, it's all about that unification of relaxation and presence. And of course, these blockages tend to be, initially you begin to discover them as contractions in these different bodies, as I mentioned earlier, literal binding. And then as you begin to you honor the truth of being bound in these different levels of being, you learn how to decontract them, let go. Then as you've learned how to decontract and you trust that process, you begin to learn how to, maybe for the first time in your life, truly and authentically relax. And then as that opens up, you develop trust in that and you take it deeper and you enter what I call the path of letting go, which means that you begin to actually almost celebrate opportunities for these contractions to rise in life. Gives you an opportunity to see if you can become increasingly skillful at the process of letting go and transformation.
You remind me of the gift of push hands there, but in life.
Yes. And then finally you go to the level where you go through so many levels of your being as you do in your work, that you finally arrive at a point where you learn that the ultimate, one of the final blockages is developing absolute trust in what is arising in the here and now and the inherent perfection of what's arising in the here and now.
Imagine absolute trust.
Deep and total trust in what is arising. And then that opens the doorway to true surrender into the gift of life. And at that point, you have the opportunity to have a taste of true liberation. Now, at all those steps, from discovering contractions, learning how to decontract, learning how to relax, to entering the pathway of letting go, to opening up a profound level of that. So this kind of universal trust opens up in your heart, your being, and then finally complete surrender into the here and now. All of those pathways, the unification of full presence with the relaxation process becomes the key. So the relaxation and the presence become like a yin yang, out of which the unification of the transformation process occurs. So that's why the third and fourth principles, after making that commitment to liberation, are relaxation and presence. And through the Way of Nature, because normally it's not just coming and doing one program, you engage in a series of deepening processes that eventually flower in a liberated being. And that's kind of the gift that you've really embraced the Way of Nature process with. I really celebrate that.
That's why I would send people, because you don't get anything fixed, but you taste the possibility of liberation. If you know, there was a psychological theorist, Eugene Gendlin. Dr. E.T. Gendlin was it, and he was Carl Rogers was a famous psychologist in the 50s and 60s, and you would know the name probably. Well, Gene took over for Carl Rogers at the University of Chicago, and he developed a plan called experiential psychotherapy that used a technique he called focusing. And without going into the details, people could look that up in the literature. The idea was to learn how to find in your body where you're contracted. He didn't use that word, but to find what the body's language was, and to bring that awareness to it so that you could, like a tight rope being uncoiling, a rubber band uncoiling, the ability to let that relax. And as you taught me once, what you will find is the reason you've been holding that tension is your fear of those emotions that are bottled up underneath that deep tension. So relaxation brings all that shit, if I may say, to the surface, shadow work. That is not a luxury, is essential to begin to learn how to truly love yourself as this imperfect human being that we are. And so Gene's work set apart those people in 1960 who were going to analysis 5 times a week and this and that for years and years. I love this, I won't get distracted, but people that were going, but never changed. They could become psychologically articulate and sophisticated about theories, but they were still stuck in their same, suffering. And he found that some people took this experience of having a therapist listen to them and help them ask questions that get beneath the turbulent surface of their neuroses down into a place of silence where the answers lie for each of us. And Gene found that there was a way to teach people how to focus, which in effect is what you're doing. So when I came to you, I already had this structure. What was missing, I tell you, is the solitude experience. As much as I feel valuable as a therapist over 40 years here, and have no question that I've been graced to be of service to many people along the way, I still will say, if you can do this, go do this and cut through. If you can do it every year or so until you get to that place is good enough. Am I good enough? If I die today, John, been through it a couple of times now, I think I'm okay. Do I want to live? Absolutely. Reb Zalman's language was live to be 150. That way, when you're 70 and you want to learn Chinese, you don't think you're too old. Well, at 71, there's things I'm picking up here. It all comes back to me listening to my true nature. And I have not found anything as effective as this program you're offering us.
This pathway of the 12 principles that you've been elaborating on, what I've discovered is so many of my students that have gone through this have then moved on past the unification of relaxation. They begin to experience a natural state of open-hearted, radiant being. It just arises naturally. It's not that they try to be open-hearted. It's just that there's a natural opening of the energy body.
Right.
And I've been a practitioner of Tai Chi and Qigong, as have you, for going on 60 years. And one of the things I discovered in those disciplines, as with yoga, hatha yoga, is as the energy body liberates, it's replaced by an experience of joy, joyfulness, and even bliss.
Mm.
And as that deepens, and we incorporate some of those kinds of practices within the way of nature to support the clear radiance of the energy body and the energy system, as that deepens, begins to manifest and radiate throughout your being, then the heart opens very naturally, because the heart is always there and available to reestablish its natural state of open-hearted connection to the rest of the cosmos. When that happens, it's an immensely joyful experience, very blissful. And at that point, one of the expressions of that bliss is what we call the 8th principle, which is the expression of compassionate activity to be of service to help make the world a better place in yourself. And then the fruit that comes through after that, you can, many of our blockages are there because of the story about who we are. And you've probably heard so many stories about that help people hold on to the blockages and the lack of presence, so they cannot arrive at the truth of their true nature and the self-referencing habit through these stories is so powerful that and the habit that we have of constantly going back to those stories kind of cements us in this rigid, fixed state of suffering. Once that begins to break free, the radiance of the energy is so profound. People are often left in a state of profound bliss and joy. But there's a bit of a danger there. You can be, as you engage in you might say, the good work of the world, you can also become attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
And and become such a good person that you have generated a new story about this great spiritual, heartfelt being that you are. And that story then becomes one of the final obstacles to the direct experience of the authentic nature of your true self.
Yeah.
And so at that point, we say that a good teacher, or life itself and the great mystery, will often provide a cutting through experience that completely cuts through that story. And what is revealed then is the true face of pure source. And at that level, the process of liberation, you've actually received a direct taste, a direct knowingness. And you can work with that direct knowingness then as a foundation that one can build on to go deeper and deeper and enter in a state of continuous recognition of source over time. But it's very helpful to have the support of a decent teacher and a process that is moving you in helping to move you in that direction. So
that teacher piece, I think, is an essential piece. I think this idea of direct transmission from what I've gotten from you, the teachings are always profound. It's something about being in your presence, and I experienced that with Mom. And with her gone, it's different. It's just good, better, worse. It's just different. But that direct transmission with a teacher such as yourself, I want to invite people into. We've lost something in this culture that is focused on the new and the shiny. And I think we're coming back to the idea of what about the ancestors and what do they have to offer? And certainly, what do the elders have to offer? I've teasingly called you grandfather, even though you're only about 12 years older than me. And you always slap me down, but that sense of devotion to you. I wrote that paper in Sun Circle coming out of Sacred Passage one year about how to treat a holy person, because I wanted your students to know what I would learn from Guru Yoga, how they benefit by learning to really surrender ego control to the teacher, not, in this kind of naive, blind, zombie-like way, but an affirmation of the transmission that's really coming through your emptiness. Does this make any sense, what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, we actually call that the power of transmission. I would say that some of the greatest blessings I've received personally have come from transmission from some of my teachers as well.
Yeah.
Vasudeva was profound. Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche was profound.
Right.
And those transmissions absolutely changed my life in helping to support and open up a little glimpse of that true nature aspect that it lies at the root of all of our being. And if we honor that, then of course it begins to flower, and we have devotion for the fact that pathway is beginning to be opened with the help of somebody that you're working with. That's it's natural to honor that. I think there's a lot of fear in our culture because we have so much devotion to the separate self, and we're caught up in that pattern of the self-referencing to support our story, or a series of stories of who we are. There's a lot of fear around the becoming so deeply connected to, it might be a human teacher, or it might be a teacher. Many of my teachers are in a non-human form.
Right.
Birds, mountain lions, jaguars, eagles, pelicans. I was going to ask you to tell that story, actually, if we hadn't been Florida.
Good story.
But I guess the point I'm getting at here is that, so in our culture, we glom onto the stories of where a teacher has appeared who is either fake or non-authentic, and who use the teacher position to abuse the relationship with students, either for money or for different things they wanted to get. But those are very rare. But the culture gloms onto those stories as a way to avoid opening up the heart and having that kind of devotion. It's a self-defense mechanism culturally. It comes out of that cultural conditioning aspect we talked about earlier. And it's understandable because our habitual self-referencing to maintain the story of who we are and what we are is our primary survival mechanism. Once that begins to be released, of course, you begin to become open-hearted, and a natural devotion actually arises for all beings that are your family members in the big family of life. So you really develop devotion for all those beings that all contain the seed of enlightenment within them. No one has any more enlightenment than anyone else. And the only difference between an authentic teacher and maybe the rest of us that have not become well established in true nature is that they've put in the time and the energy and the work to clarify and then get the glimpse and then begin to establish a continuing state of recognition of that true aspect of our source being.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when that happens, there is a natural radiance, and the field that is generated from that establishment, becoming well established in source, is profound. And that field changes and helps support the individual opening of the seed of liberation that lies within the heart of every human being and every being of nature. So,
and you know that, and I know that. And that's why I can do the work that I do in the midst of great despair, because I know that within each of us is that self waiting to point the way, to show the next step, to relieve the sadness and the fear. It's all possible. However, people have to do their own work. I don't want to be threatening here, but therapists in general, many of them don't do their own work. You know, they're skillful at a certain level, but the ability to take people into hell and back, traditionally, one has to have accomplished that themselves in some way.
Yeah.
People don't come to therapy because they want to grow. People come to therapy because they're suffering. The ones who come in and just want to try on dream analysis or something never last. They don't do the work because the work is very challenging to face yourself and bring. The Dalai Lama's formula is, I've used with people, everybody gets it, ruthless honesty with yourself and unconditional compassion. And now that word unconditional is not to be taken lightly. Unconditional compassion with your ruthless honesty. That's shadow work proper, and that's the foundation of discovering the great depths of who we are in Jung's model. The idea of being able to face that which you have not been able to see, not wanted to see, been afraid to see, reject and hate to see, that until you can love all of you and find a way that that is a gift, the ability to weave that in. So I want to say sacred passage, the way of nature. Many will be interested. Few may come. It's unfortunate, but I trust that the many hundreds, if not thousands of people that have experienced this process are watering seeds around the world. We know many of them. Watering seeds around the world in a time of cataclysmic change, that if I allow Hawk, which has been my friend since the Chiricahuas in 2003, teaching me almost every day, if I allow Hawk to remind me to rise up and to see a larger perspective of transformation of the world, I don't have false hope, but I have a genuine trust. I was driving again, I think it was Oklahoma. Oklahoma must have been a big state for me. When Mother told me, don't to worry. I've heard her as clear as a bell. And I'm driving across this vast Oklahoma landscape with no cars in sight, right? And I felt this presence of the mother just saying, it's up to you all. Whether you want to be part of it or not, it's up to you all. I'm going to be fine. You know, I know that there is a way to critique that and say that the earth is not going to be fine unless we change our ways. And yet at a deeper level, I think we're just a breath waiting to see if we actually want to taste the banquet of what she's offering us.
I agree.
So let me give you a couple stories. Can I do that? I'm feeling like I need to wind down here, rambling, and I'll lose my train of thought. You know, the principles, we didn't quite finish them, but the idea of these 12 principles to return to source has been a great gift. Continue to remind myself, go to source when I'm feeling unbattled, but to serve as a warrior of the open heart and liberated spirit. I think it's necessary to remind people that don't worry about you getting ahead of yourself. Ultimately, this process takes you out of yourself. That ego dissolves into the majesty and magic of the self. You become a warrior for the mother and for the open heart that humanity needs. This is not an ego inflating exercise. In fact, quite the opposite. But it's fun too. I mean, I make it sound like work. It is play. I danced up in the mountain there at 11,500 feet in 95. I'm doing my Chang Man Chang form up in the mountain there. I'm kind of looking for mountain lion from 92, 3 years later. I think I screamed, some mountain lion screamed to try, I'm attached, right? I'm attached. And so I'm dancing my form, and I come around and I look up on the mountain, and don't you know, I see this brown lithe figure. And I think, is it a goat? And no, it's a couple 100 yards away this time, but it's lion. Just after I had surrendered all attachment. And John, in that moment, I became a butterfly. I'm dancing Tai Chi of no form around the plateau up there for I don't know how long.
One of my favorite stories that of my experience of spending time with you in Florida was when we went down to the beach to
remember that,
to spend a little time with that beautiful Atlantic coast near Palm Beach, and you had to go back, I think, to take care
I
of
had to go get Andy. Andy was in kindergarten or first grade. Yeah.
So you left me, and I found out there was a nice quiet spot on the beach, and I began meditating, and a pelican came in, and I ended up meditating with the pelican, establishing quite a beautiful relationship. And I remember you came back, I guess, with Andy after.
The pelican was there. The pelican came down the beach. Some gauchos, some Guatemalan guys that were celebrating on the beach and all dressed up, and they came up. The pelican never moved. The pelican was about 7 feet away from you and I sitting, yoga form, sitting doing meditation. A little boy came up and touched that pelican on the head, and that pelican never moved, right? I got up, I went, picked up Andy. That was a half an hour. I came back, pelican never moved, right? Then we got up to stand.
It quite a circle of people around.
There was people around. People couldn't believe it. One woman had walked an hour and a half down the beach and back again, and she couldn't believe that this pelican was still there. What was beautiful is when you and I got up and stood up to do some form, the pelican simply just moved a few feet away and just cocked its head and continued to watch us. Now, what I want to add to that is I have seen not just that experience. I've at the West Palm Beach Zoo, I've seen a cougar come up to you, literally come up to you. They had those white tigers there. They came right up to you in the glass. I'm not making this up. The manatees on the river up here at Kashi swam right up to you and made love and just right in front of us for half an hour. The rattlesnake that swam across the Sebastian River when we were out on the boat, Gangaji's boat, and bumped its head against our boat just saying hi to us and then swam off. I've seen these experiences.
These are called totemic experiences. What they're representative of is the bonding with nature and the rest of life and other family members in the bodies of other species that becomes profoundly established as your family. So the family relationships, then the celebration of that arises in the way that you've just been describing.
It's not such fun. It's just such a delight.
Beautiful things about these totemic encounters is that they represent a kind of deep reconnection with the bigger family of life, which is one of the gigantic things missing in the modern world. We have beautiful pets. Doug has a wonderful snake called Bindu that I love visiting every time I'm in Florida. And most of us have cats and dogs and maybe some fish. But when you encounter a connection with wild beings of nature whose consciousness is very pure and often reflects a certain facet of nature and a potential facet of opening yourself in your own consciousness and in your own heart. These totemic experiences provide that special relationship which opens up something which I think is going to be the key to reestablishing ourselves in deep communion with the big family of life. Those are the beautiful experiences that begin to transmit the secrets of how to reestablish becoming part of a really caring and harmonious family member in the big family. So these totemic encounters are not small things. they represent significant keys to the opening of a brand new relationship between our species and the rest of our big family.
Yep. In 1995, I knew I was called to go higher and deeper, whatever that meant. I could hear the voice calling from the other side of the Crestone Creek. In August, I came back, and I told you I needed to do that. I needed to go away from Sun Circle and go on my own up 5 miles up, 4,000 feet there, right? 3,500 feet. And you said, do. Roger Wharton took me up to the edge of the trail, and I hiked up, and it was an ordeal for this old fat man, I was pushing myself to get up there, stumbled into camp. I had 9 days that I could devote to the solitude, so I committed to that. Without too many details, it was just a marvelous experience. I told you the one about the lion, the becoming butterfly, and towards the 5th or 6th day, I would say, I hear this noise. Now, I had seen maybe 7 or 8 people the entire 9 days. They were all on horseback. Nobody else had hiked up to that. Not, I'm sure people do, but everybody was on horseback. They were all in a distance across the valley there, going up to the fish up at the lake, right? And I'm here, who would bring a jukebox up here? Like somebody carrying a music box, because I hear this music. The next day, I realized it was not people, it was the mountains singing to me. In the beginning of the week, those mountains up there were austere and serious, and no trees above the tree line, just fierce. But by this time, I was opening, my heart was opening. And so I could hear the mountains sing, and I'd have to look at my journal, but I think in the north was popular music, and in the east was jazz, and in the south might have been classical music, but in the west was First Nation people music, drums and singing, right? I've had that a few times. Down in New Mexico, I had that. The mountains sang this song. And if you allow me, I'll sing you this song. They taught me this song. Onge ho, onge ho, onge, onge, onge ho. Yeah, I heard this music, and so me being who I am, I said, Mountain, what's that song mean? And the mountain said, you talk too much, little brother. I said, I know. But what's the song mean? The mountain said, it's written on your heart. I said, I know, but what's the song mean? Mountain said, be silent and still.
Beautiful.
It's my whole life now, learning.
Beautiful. Well, wonderful having you here today, Doug. Thanks for spending the time sharing your amazing array of experiences and openings.
May it bless all people. May it bless everyone who needs a little hope and encouragement that might stumble onto this.